Hey everyone, today we're going to do a book review. There's a new book that came out by 𝘧𝘪𝘳𝘚𝘧. We'll tell you all about him too. All of us are always looking for a good book to read to improve our skill set, level up our game, whatever it is. And this book I particularly recommend to anybody that is already in the CCO seat, but is experiencing some challenges, or they want to be in the CCO seat or just got promoted to it. So even if you're just a team leader and one day you're aspiring to be a CCO and you feel like people are holding you back from being a manager to director, this is such a great book. I honestly found that it has a lot of really good tips for executives in general, but there's a lot of stuff that's very specific to the CCO. So if you want to understand the role, even if you're a CEO and you want to understand the role or thinking about establishing a role, you should read this book. All right. So I have with me none other but the author 𝘧𝘪𝘳𝘚𝘧, who's been an executive himself for many, many years. And he's been very fortunate to be with some of the most customer-centric companies in the world, like Intact, Marketo, Gainsight, and RingCentral. And he is here to talk about his book. We're going to cover a few of the chapters that in his books to kind of reveal a little bit important nuggets and have him expand a bit more than what's actually in the book. And I highly encourage you to actually purchase it. So we'll include a link to Amazon so you can buy it either as an Audible or get the soft copy here. I read all of it. Obviously, I had a lot of bookmarks and honestly good stuff. Highly recommend reading it. Rod, welcome to our podcast. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your book.
Great. Thanks, Irit. How are you? It's so great to see you. We've known each other for so many years, and it's nice to finally be on your talk today. I've always been really thoughtful about frameworks and strategies and things that are repeatable. So it got me into this process of, hey, I should write a book because I think there's an important need for it.
It sounds like in your book, you kind of goes through the history of chief customer officers. And you mentioned to me that right now there's about 4,000 chief customer officers based on LinkedIn search alone. You mentioned in your book that something happened sort of like in 2015, where we honestly, like before that, there were barely any. And all of a sudden we started seeing more and more companies looking for chief customer officer or creating that. What do you think propelled that job to all of a sudden emerge on LinkedIn?
Yeah. So kind of going back in time, the role of chief customer officer, or sometimes it was called chief customer experience officer, was someone that was gathering information from customers, often in VOC surveys or net promoter surveys, and trying to interpret it, and then feeding that information back to various other functional teams. But that executive didn't necessarily have resources of their own organizations that could help drive change. They had to influence the product team to make changes to the product, or influence the marketing team to set better expectations or messaging. And what happened in like around 2014, 2015 is that executive level role, whether it was a CCO or an SVP or VP, became responsible for the outcomes. And they started to then have operating teams that were part of their organizations. And they became accountable for the metrics. They became accountable for getting customers implemented through an implementation or services team. They became responsible for a retention metric or an expansion metric. They became responsible for the support outcomes and the profitability of those teams. And so they started to assemble actual organizations that often are a large percentage of the employees at a company. And when this started to happen, it gave those chief customer officers or equivalent roles a lot more influence in the decision-making and a lot more accountability for contributing to business results. But at the same time, the individuals that were being asked to be in these roles were still relatively new and relatively young in their careers. And there wasn't a framework of best practices and processes that they could just overlay into their business practices to get these repeatable results. So a lot of it is, as you and I have both seen over the last 5 to 7 years, is people trying to figure out, okay, how do I get customers implemented more quickly? How do I increase retention? What metrics am I looking at? What are the signals? And so one of the ideas of the book was to help codify some of the skills and strategies that aspiring leaders or people in these type of executive level roles can use to help apply to their businesses to get these predictable, repeatable results.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the book does is it really spells out what should be the expectation from the role, how should the success or the efficacy of the execution of the responsibilities should be measured, and then how to avoid pitfalls. I think just like touching on all these aspects really makes a great case for sort of like standardizing what should the CCO role standard should be. And so the other thing that you do really well in the book is on page 30, you really outline the responsibilities and the expectations from the chief customer officer, as well as really outline very carefully where should the CCO sit in the organization. And you talk about a couple of options that I thought were really interesting. Maybe you could share your perspective on where should the CCO sit in the organization and where are exceptions should be accommodated.
Yeah, most of the time, I would hope and expect that the CCO position will be a member of their CEO staff, that they would have an equal voice with the other leaders, whether that's a VP, SVP, or a chief level role. There are some organizations where that isn't practical, or the CEO has too big a staff, and they sometimes may have that position report to a chief operating officer. Sometimes it reports to a chief revenue officer if the leader of the post-sale organization is perhaps a little bit more junior in their career. And so I don't think there's a one size fits all. And I provide some ideas in the book about when it should be reported into the CEO and increasingly in some other organizations. But my hope is that most CCOs should be able to be on the CEO's direct staff.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that in some cases you've seen it reported to the CRO or to the COO. In my experience, when this happened, usually they don't have a C title. It's mostly like the VP of Customer Success or the senior VP. But as soon as they get a C title, I've never seen it report under a CRO or a COO. It's usually predominantly, once you get the C title, you're under the CEO. Is that your experience as well?
That's generally been my experience. And as you mentioned, not all organizations have somebody that's operating yet at that C level,
right?
Even if they have those set of responsibilities, and the CEO may make a decision that they don't have the time or skill set to be able to coach and up level that leader. And sometimes having them report to a COO or a CRO enables that individual to get more mentorship.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction, because this book, when you sometimes refer to CCO, it's really the person responsible for all post-sale functions, or most of them. And you take a moment on page 34 to really spell out what should functions those be, and what sometimes you get to see some more, kind of like talk about all the findings that you had when you're doing the research for the book. But it's really also about, if you don't have the CCO title yet, but you're still doing all this work, how can you get that C-level title and get the seat at the table and presenting to the board? Maybe there's some skills missing. Maybe there's other things that you need to work on. So all of that is really like a great play. That's why it's a playbook. It's a playbook for the CCO seat. So maybe we can talk about, in your research and findings, what are the most typical functions that you've seen chief customer officers have under them, and what are some of the outliers where you see them only ever so often?
Yeah. So what I see most common particularly in technology companies, is that they're responsible. If you think about the customer journey, they're responsible for a team that works with new customers. Sometimes it's called professional services or implementation or onboarding. Then you have an organization that provides some type of product support, so sometimes called support or tech support organization. Third team is often the success management organization, sometimes called customer success managers. A customer education and certification team is often part of their responsibilities. And then increasingly, there's a customer operations team that's helping to manage and maintain the systems and processes, sometimes special projects, sometimes the reporting and dashboards, to help work across those functions. Other less common organizations are sometimes community sometimes customer marketing or some type of automated but customer-focused demand gen organization focused on expansion. I think those are the most common ones that I see.
Yeah. And I love how in your book, you actually expand, you take each one of these functions and you spell it out to the CCO, not only what should they be doing with that function, but also you provide a really nice, very clear framework on what should the success metrics. So how do you know you're doing a good job with that function? And you split it into customer metrics, internal metrics, and input metrics. In the book, I noted that you actually spell out what is the difference between the 3 types of metrics, but then you can double click on what is the difference between internal metrics and input metrics.
And you talked about earlier, what's different between someone that's operating at a C level and somebody that is operating at a functional team level. And one of those differentiators is, are they thinking about the company level metrics? Are they contributing to company goals? And so by being able to differentiate, hey, what are the couple of metrics that our CEO and CFO care about? And am I doing a good job influencing that? Versus all the things that my team is watching and monitoring on a day-to-day that are sort of the inputs to those outcomes. And so that's what I try and talk about in the book, is differentiating between those.
Aligning to the company's strategy and proving or like showcasing how you contributed to that is all part of the Chief Customer Officer Maturity Model that you present in your book on page 65. Where does that fit in that model exactly? And then what are the other aspects and strategies that you think somebody that really wants to be a mature, highly successful, effective Chief Customer Officer should really pay attention to?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, one of the things that I've enjoyed doing in my career is helping to put together sort of frameworks that make it easy for others to understand whatever it is that we're doing. And in this case, the CCO Maturity Model is a set of 8 skills and strategies that, through my experience and research, that I believe are the skills that are important for someone that is either in that CCO role or that wants to be a CCO to be able to develop. And so the book is based around those 8 skills. There's 8 core chapters. Each one of them goes into detail into those particular skills. And it talks about what are some of the activities that you can be doing on a daily, monthly, annual basis to help build your capabilities around them. And we can talk about one of them around, like, for example, communication and storytelling. That's kind of what the CCO Maturity Model is. And then the idea would be you can look at each of these 8 areas and identify which of them are your strengths, which of them are gaps and opportunities, and then focus in whatever, in the next quarter, over the next year, in developing skills in that particular area. So you can sort of ask yourself where you want to get better. You might have a discussion with your manager. On my website, I talk about, there's a resource on 𝘧𝘪𝘳𝘠𝑒𝑟𝑘𝑠.com that you can download some worksheets around the CCO Maturity Model so that you can both have that discussion with your manager and then help set expectations about what's expected of you in the role so that you can earn this opportunity to expand your scope or get promoted.
That's awesome. And I think one of the things that you really wanted to talk about today was something that any executive that wants to be a great Chief Customer Officer can do. And in terms of things that are easy to implement and embrace almost immediately as a short-term win.
What's been really fun since the book came out in the beginning of February are readers that are getting the book and reading through it and sending me notes on LinkedIn or on instant message about how easy it has been for them to identify some activity or some strategy that they can apply in their day-to-day. And like a couple of examples, there's a whole chapter around the importance of communication and the ability to tell stories. Yeah, there you go. Communicate. Strategy.
Page 127.
Yeah.
Communicate effectively and tell stories.
It's really important for evolving leaders to do a couple things. So one, for example, is understanding your audience. That your audience for communications can be your direct team, and you can talk about them in one way, and maybe they understand a level of detail. Then you might have other functional organizations like a sales team that you want to communicate with. And you don't want to get into too much detail. They're not paying attention at their sales all hands if you get 15 minutes. You have to think about what are your key messages that you want to get across and what will they remember in that particular audience. And then another might be if you have an opportunity to present at your CEO staff. They don't want to hear all the details of the day-to-day, but they want to understand and really kind of remember, how do you bring this stuff to life? And so one of the skills I talk about is the ability to tell stories. How many times do you sit in meetings and somebody puts up a PowerPoint slide and there's a bunch of bullets and there's a chart and you were to leave and you're like, I have no idea. There's no takeaway. But a skill for a customer-facing executive should be to think about telling stories that people can remember. And on my website, there's a resources section that has some links to resources about how to tell effective stories, some books that I recommend around that type of skill set. And to make it memorable, like to talk about site visit that one of your CSMs made to a customer where they learned something that they didn't learn and they could bring it back. Maybe it's an expansion opportunity. So I had a client that I was talking with a couple of weeks ago, and I encouraged them to do these site visits. One of their CSMs went out, one of their clients was Apple, and they went out to the Apple store and they were watching the salesperson try to find whether they had inventory for this particular iPad. And the company makes a tool. They actually weren't using their tool, but Apple was using sort of an open source solution to see whether the inventory was in the back. And they watched them and they realized that they weren't actually using that application. They asked why. And they said, well, it took like 5 to 7 seconds to load and it had lots of errors. So this created an opportunity for the CSM to say, oh my gosh, we have a solution to that. Our customers are not using our product. But then it created an opportunity to go talk to the VP of the Apple store and create an expansion opportunity. And so you can bring some of these experiences to life with stories that are very different than saying, like, in this situation, we capture an opportunity and we enter it in Salesforce and they're like, blah, blah, blah. They don't remember that. But then you put it in terms of the Apple store or a visit to Sephora or whoever your customer is. And your audience can then picture themselves in that situation, having that problem, and they're much more likely to remember it. And it also demonstrates the value of what your team is doing. So in the book, literally dozens of tips like this in all of these different skills to think about how you can be applying this in the day-to-day that you're already doing in your customer-facing experiences.
Yeah, that's awesome. So there's like the maturity model with the 8 strategies, and each one of these strategies not only include a clear explanation of what it is, things that they action items to consider and questions that they should ask themselves to assess their level of maturity in each one of the ability to execute on each one of these strategies and skill sets. And then you end the book with part number 3, which really focuses on action items for them. And what I really enjoyed reading this area here, that all about how to accelerate the path. And one of the things that you're putting together here is sort of like challenges that chief customer officers and those who wants to be one face. And there are sort of like almost like external conditions that sometimes occur in a company, and how should you be handling those? So maybe you could talk about 1 or 2 of the most common challenges and what do these CCOs typically face?
Yeah. Well, often one of the things that they face is maybe a CEO or an executive team that doesn't entirely understand what they do. There aren't a ton of CEOs, unfortunately, that have been chief customer officers. I hope that this is one of the areas that having a book like this will help accelerate the number of CCOs in the world. And then one of the trends I see is more CCOs taking on CEO roles. But a lot of times they don't come from that background. In the technology world that many of us may be in, they may come out of product or engineering organizations. They may come out of sales leadership roles, but not often understanding what goes into actually delivering great experiences to customers on a predictable, repeatable basis. And it then becomes part of your responsibility to help educate the CEO, not like slam them on the head and say, hey, this is what I do, But again, through effective communication, through stories, and through the delivery of results that enable them to do their job. CEOs have a very complex job. I'm not sure I'd want to be one of them. I know it's really challenging, and they expect us as CCOs or as customer-facing executives to play a particular role on our team. And because it's a relatively new position, it may be hard for them to understand, well, what do you do? Sales has been around for decades. You say, well, what does a sales leader do? They kind of know. What does a marketing leader do? They kind of know. What does a CFO do? What does a CCO do? They don't know. So I would suggest give them a copy of the book, and it should set some expectation. They're actually one of the key audiences for whom I wrote the book.
I agree with you. I think it's a great book for anybody that just wants to understand the role, if it's a new role or it's the one that they are about to launch. The other challenge that I thought was really interesting that you mentioned in your book is not only educating the executive team, but also to prove the ROI that your team has delivered. Maybe you could talk about that. What is the challenge here, and why do some CCOs either don't advocate for themselves or they don't advocate effectively? What's going on there?
It often, because their executive team and their peers often don't know how to judge the effectiveness of customer-facing leader or the CCO, that they make assumptions. And so it's important for that leader to be able to set expectations and connect the dots between the work that is being done by their teams and the outcomes that it delivers for their companies. And one of the big sort of aha moments for that executive level leader is realizing that their primary team is their set of peers and their CEO and their board. And they need to be able to make trade-offs, and they need to be able to communicate how the work that they're doing, like all the day-to-day, yes, it's hard, and yes, it's complicated, but they need to simplify it for those leadership teams. Say, hey, I'm going to do this, and here's the outcomes we're going to deliver. And unfortunately, those CCOs, those customer-facing leaders can't always do that. We've got big teams, and they're doing lots of stuff. But how do we translate it into what the company really cares about, which is revenue growth, which is profitability, which is sort of creating expansion opportunities, designing good customer experiences that are repeatable and predictable. And that's kind of it. All the day-to-day is what you're responsible for. So this ability to storytell, this ability to have clear strategies communicated to different organizations is an important skill set that more people need to develop. And I think if they kind of read through the book and get these tips, they'll become more effective at connecting the dots between what their teams are doing and what their company needs from them.
That's awesome. Rob, thank you so much. I did want to make a recommendation to buy this awesome book. Like I said, we're going to include the link in the description of the video below. So go ahead and click on that link and get that book either as a gift or to yourself or to your chief executive officer. All the power to you, Rod. Every time I see somebody actually accomplishing this goal of writing a book, I'm completely at awe. So thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your experiences and expertise and putting it all into such a great consumable book with really brilliant frameworks. I think this is going to help a lot, the industry in general and specific software companies and, of course, individuals' careers. So thank you for all your contribution. And I really appreciate you coming to the show today and sharing your insights with us. And hopefully this helped promote the book.
Great. Thanks so much, Iri. It's great talking with you.
Awesome. All right. If you like this video, give it a like. Connect with Rod. I'll include the link to his LinkedIn profile as well as his website in the video description below. And you'd like to see more videos, subscribe to our podcast and smash that notification button so that you could see more videos as they come out. And I will see you at the next video. Big love from me.